issues, and of course very topical issues, 2 complete days that we are going to be spending together on the subject of the different low-carbon mobilities. And the first day today focuses on the institutional aspects and the political aspects in a difficult context that the European industrial sector is going through today, and there are geostrategic issues as we are on the threshold of the publication tomorrow of the New Deal. So this is a more technical day today, it's more scientific. Tomorrow will be organized on the base of call for papers, which will be selected by a committee chaired by the IFPEN and a jury of European experts on these different themes. So welcome again to here Po and the Po Urban District, which is welcoming this 4th forum with the participation. And of course, we'd like to thank our partners Terega, IFPEN, NACRA, and Bioethanol France, and the various bodies that represent the bioethanol and biofuel areas, and Cria Sud Communication, which organizes events in this area. Mr. Mohamed Amara, who is a deputy of the mayor of Po, and he is going to be opening this forum officially. Good morning, and thank you for being here, all of you. I think I can start now, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you all. First of all, I'd like you to ask to excuse Mr. François BAYROU, who has had to stay in Paris for other commitments, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Mr. BAYROU and on behalf of the City of Po. This forum is the 4th forum to take place after the 2022 one. The format has changed considerably, and we'd like to recall the commitment in favor of decarbonized mobilities, and we're moving towards carbon neutrality. These are issues which are very much an important element, and we want to, if we want to move towards carbon neutrality with the horizon of 2040, if I'm correct. I wanted also to underline the importance for the territory of the question of the energy mix and the importance of various solutions which can be provided to solve this kind of problem and achieve our objectives as quickly as possible. I'd like to recall that Po and the Béarn generally is a territory which considers that the question of energy is very important. And of course its history contributes to that with LAC, with natural gas, and the reconversion of the gas basin in LAC. It's a territory which is both industrial and agricultural, and so that it means that we can look at the issues of biofuels, and they're very important for us in those 2 respects. And with repercussions on a certain number of projects which we are paying particular attention to, and we hope that there's just a point, but this has been mentioned on the format of the forum. This version in 2025 will have some roundtables with institutional representatives in France and throughout Europe, and we would have translation, and I'd like to welcome the translators. The industries and researchers and people representing infrastructures, finance, the builders, forestry people, farmers, and all of these panels will be discussing these issues. We will also have a scientific session under the responsibility of a scientific committee chaired by the IFPEN. It used to be the French Petroleum Institute, but it's now focused on new energies. And I'd like to welcome the representative who's going to give the next presentation. And to conclude, I'd like to thank the sponsors who have made this event possible: Terega, IFPEN, Access, Bioethanol France, and the other companies that have been supporting us. We had 2 excellent days. We've got sunshine, we have a blue sky, and we can see the Pyrenees. So it's up to us now to carry on from there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Amara. And we're now going to welcome Pierre-Franck CHEVET, who's going to give an introduction to the forum with his expert viewpoint. He's the president of IFP New Energies. He's a consultant on research in energy for various governments with the Ministry of the Economy and Sustainable Development and Territorial Development, and he's president of Nuclear Safety. Mr. CHEVET, good morning. Good morning to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, local representatives, national representatives. Thank you for welcoming me. This is the 3rd time that I'm going to be taking part in this event, this format, and it's always a great pleasure for me to take part in this event, which is a reference event in low carbon mobility. And of course, I'm using both the English and French terms, decarbonation or decarbonization. I'd like to take this opportunity while we get the slides going. We are the heirs of the French Petroleum Institute, but we are happy to be part of this inheritance. And we were created very much at the end of the Second World War, 1 week after D-Day. It was very much at the end of the war, and France had lack of energy throughout the war, because our German friends had taken some of that energy from us. But there was a lack of energy. They also didn't have enough energy to support their war effort. And I'll return to it's a rather complicated world at the moment, and there's a crisis at the moment. The founding act of the French Petroleum Institute at the time, we talked about the beginning with the need to have substitute fuels. It's astonishing to face that when we're talking about biofuels. And this is something we need to bear in mind. So this is our inheritance. And we have had, over the 10 years, we're at 70% of oil and gas. Now we have 80%, which is green. And this is very important for us. I don't know many institutions who've changed so quickly and so powerfully as we have done. And I'm going to be talking about money, of course, straight away. We have 20% of oil and gas, which is residual. And this is, I could give you figures for that. I'm not going to give them now because we need to sell, but it's very profitable. And the profit of this activity is injected to boost the development of green energy sources. There's no representative of the government here, I think, but this is called a carbon tax. And it works. And it works, and that's what has enabled us, using the inheritance of our past, we've been able to use this to fund the energy transition. And I'm going to begin straight away with questions concerning money. It was a very quick presentation of the changes in energy prices over the period between began before COVID until today. At the top, on the left, you have the changes in oil prices. Of course, you can see all the markets have had periods of great volatility and also increasing, connected with the different crises that we have been having to face. What you can see, and the important thing is that for oil, which you can see at the top left, for natural gas in Europe, and for the European supply of gas, and for electricity, you can see that these three markets have stabilized slightly, and perhaps they've reduced a bit over the last few weeks, but they're higher than the pre-crisis level. Another interpretation is that the factors of uncertainty today, I'll talk about that, the conflict in Ukraine and conflicts in the Middle East, American sanctions and tariffs and so on. This is still a period of crisis, which gives this extra risk connected with the energy prices of energies, for all the energies that we use. So it's a crisis with persistent effects on prices of energy. On natural gas, the increase, you can see a zoom on 2024. If you look at the changes between 2019, we were at 14, we're currently at approximately 40 for gas. The explanation, it's a pretty high increase over the period. A lot of things that can explain this. The price in Europe is about twice the price it was before COVID. Those are the figures I gave. And it's 4 to 5 times higher than the prices in the United States. And of course, that has a very substantial impact. There's been a reconfiguration because of the crisis in Ukraine. The gas flows in Europe, which came from the east in the past and now come more from the west in the form of LNG. And of course, this makes the final cost even higher. Now I'm going to come back to the climate now. The first thing we have to say is that 2024 was the hottest year ever recorded in human history. And we exceeded the 1.5 degrees increase with regard to the pre-industrial period. And climate warming is very clear. We're beginning to see things with damage that is caused, negative events, a number of phenomena that have been observed, which are very impressive. I think particularly fires in California, with the insurance companies, which are beginning to raise problems connected with that. So we can see physically the results of climate warming, which are beginning to appear very clearly, and we can have some idea of the damage that that's going to cause. And in this context, Europe is in a phase of transition, trying to carry out the transition. It's not true in all areas of the world, but in Europe, we're doing the job. We have long-term commitments on carbon neutrality, with local implications, of course. We have some powerful commitments. But beyond those general commitments, we also have regulations in Europe which have been set up in order to confront these questions. They've been thought about carefully, and they give recommendations to the market to see which direction they're going to be moving in. And that's particularly the case for biofuels. And we can have a zoom on electricity. You can see that green energies, or renewable energies, are developing very substantially with regard to 2019, currently 46%. Combustible fuels and nuclear represent 54%. So we have a kind of parity between renewable energies, the new energies, and the more conventional energy sources. So that's one of the good bits of news. That overall, the same figures in terms of development for everything that is renewable in the world confirms that trend. If you look at investment in the oil and gas sector, they're more or less flat, perhaps going down a little over the last recent period. But investment, I'm talking about investment, not about production, but investment in renewable energies are moving up very fast. They've gone beyond investment in oil and gas. It's obviously not enough for what we need to do to counter global warming, but it's a very powerful signal that there is an awareness not only in Europe but throughout the world that action was required. This is a slide, I hesitated rather. This was a comment on American politics, perhaps. It's more something for a question and answer session, but this is an analysis of the strategy of the Trump administration, which is dominated by energy at the expense of environmental protection, where the first idea is to maximize the production of oil and gas, drill, baby, drill, that Donald Trump declared. A certain number of environmental regulations are being removed, and there's also a selective approach to decarbonization technologies. They are pretty much ahead of the pack with the capture of carbon and carbon storage, nuclear, and on nuclear fusion, but they perhaps also on critical materials with the idea of sovereignty. Biofuels, not exactly the same approach as the European approach. Perhaps there are developments in what we could call G+, which are developments, but there are some very negative points in terms of decarbonisation. A number of wind turbine projects have been blocked, and the end of subsidies to electric vehicles. That's all part of what's happening. And also, of course, they have exited the Paris Agreement. This is just an observation. If you have any questions about that, I will try and answer. But I'm not sure that could explain all of Donald Trump's strategy. This slide is interesting, and I found this, it's a very recent slide. This is the question of adaptation to climate change, and an article which came out, which has not yet been fully validated, but which came out in 2024, which documents the cost of damage. We tend to say that this is something which is going to require mitigation and so on. It's going to be much more expensive. But this is one of the only articles that I've seen which is documenting rather accurately what that situation might be. The damages, you can see, disturbed ecosystems, reduced agricultural production, a lot of damage. I think everybody is aware of that. And what the article did, and this was a study that was done at a world level, was to try to provide figures for the consequences of two scenarios. The scenario in red is if we do nothing. We leave things as they are, or as they're going to be, and we can see what the damage is, because we're not going to be putting money into mitigation. The other is the sum of those two. This is perhaps if we're rather more ambitious in the combat against climate change, we invest a lot of money there, and this is an estimate that the article does. If we look at the impact on GNP of this, at the order of 4.5% of GNP up to 2030, it's a very intense effort, and then it would need to be maintained at about 2.5% of GNP from then on. So it's a scenario which is pretty ambitious, which is towards net zero emission. The other is the scenario where we continue to do nothing. And the interesting thing to see, and it took me a while to understand this chart, if you look at the right, that's 2000, on the left is 2050, the green base is if the mitigation and limitation. The blue part is all the damage that's caused. If you do nothing, it's in red. You can see that in 2050, the difference is not that substantial. However, where it is really serious, if we look a little further, and you can see that the scenarios become very different, and the impact, if we do nothing in 2100, perhaps you can't read the legend, but it's about over 60% of GNP. So this is an impact on GNP, world GNP, Before that happens, other things will have happened. This is not the world of today. It's a very different world that we're considering. Very different from anything we can imagine. So if we need to bear in mind that it's work for who in the end, not necessarily for our children. We're working for, the idea is to minimize damage that could affect our grandchildren or our future grandchildren. Politically, it's not easy to base a policy which is going to have a positive effect on people that we don't even maybe know yet. So I think that's something that's very important to bear in mind, and that's a real political question, which is to look at these time frames in politics, which of course there's a cost involved in all of this, and the estimates of the costs for net zero, with a few examples on fuels, for example, costs which are very substantial. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Transport, on the left, these are the figures for the trends for our collective emissions, not just transport, but all sectors, since 1990, so that you can see that Europe has been doing the job, and there has been progress, and a significant part of emissions in Europe is the red part, that is transports, and those are figures for Europe. 25% of CO2 emissions in Europe are connected with transport. And it's very striking when you look at the trends in the different sectors for CO2 emissions. For the energy part, there has been a gain overall. A number of other issues for industry too. There have been reductions, maybe connected with the fact that we have lost jobs in industry, and of course that's something which we cannot exclude from the calculation. But some sectors have not progressed, but have actually, in the red bar today, if you compare that between 1990 and today, this is the sector that we really need to focus on. And so it's very logical that these annual European forums should focus on mobility, because mobility is a major issue which we are confronted with. And then a few elements to break that down and look at the different influence of various parts in transport. You can see that most of our emissions, more than 50%, are individual private cars. The vans and so on is 15%, and heavy goods vehicles 22%. And somebody obviously knew that I was a motorbike rider, and you see that motorbikes, two-wheeled mobility represents 1%, and of course bikers are good for the environment as well. Perhaps because there aren't enough bikers because of the number of accidents that they're faced with. But that's another problem. But it's important to have those figures in mind. In red, the non-road transport only concerns less than 10% of mobility at the moment. You can see air travel, which is the majority of that 8 or 9%. Rail is a very low part. This is in France, and that's also because of decarbonization of the French electricity mix. Maritime is 30%, less than air transport, and then also a certain number of miscellaneous transport modes. I think this gives you a fairly clear picture. It's not easy to understand, but it's relatively clear. On air transport, thanks to the regulations, we can see more or less which direction we're moving in. On other issues, it's not so clear. Particularly heavy goods vehicles, it's not very clear. And maritime is also not very clear, even though there are some avenues for progress, but it's not that easy to follow up. So if we look at the levers for decarbonization of transport, there's one thing that we need to recall, is that the probably the easiest first thing to look at is sobriety. sobriety in terms of size, the fact that we have big cars, SUVs, which are heavy, with poor air penetration capacity. That's not what we need to do. We need to work as we did a long time ago in the 1970s. There was a whole campaign in France about trying to avoid waste and wasting energy and so on, and a lot of that was focused on the areas of the size of vehicles and so on, things that could be done to have better airflow. And that's not necessarily something which is more expensive, but it can lead to a certain number of savings. It's an elegant way of not wasting energy. And of course, reducing speed, that has not always been very popular, but that's also one way of making savings. Everything that's been done in terms of car sharing and so on, that is good. Of course, that's moving in the right direction. And then there are all the questions about organizations, of organizing transport within a territory. And a lot of work remains to be done there. Electrification, which is not as fast as that in Europe. Most of the growth is actually at the moment in China in terms of electrification of vehicles. If you look at the forecast that we have for the European car pool, we had 5%, looking at the fleet, the total fleet, and not looking at sales, but looking at the fleet, 5% in 2024, 8% estimated for 2026, and maybe 30% for 2030. That's the situation. We're a long, long way away, and particularly if we look in terms of the overall fleet, we're a long way from actually implementing that solution. And if we look at low carbon fuels, there are changes in the European regulations which are fairly clear, maybe not in all aspects, but we have RED II, Refuel EU in aviation and Fuel EU for maritime transport, giving a framework that enables us to forecast the production and consumption of biofuels, whether they're 1G or 2G, within different time frames. This slide I use very often, and it's called, I call this cock-a-doodle-doo. This is the French cock crowing, but the work that's been done in the organization in Paris, doing great work for this difficult subject. EA is giving us a certain idea of how we can progress in this area. They are sometimes attacked by the United States in the way that they approach problems of energy in the world for obvious reasons, and referred to my previous slide. And there's very clear discourse on the energy transition with the IEA. Maybe not quite so clear on the American side. There's been a ranking of all the public services in terms of research in the world on the energy transition and low carbon energies. And the 7 first in the world, there are 3 French. The first is the CEA, because nuclear power is important in this ranking. Also very good for fuels. They're very good at fuel cells. IFPEN, about 1,700 people. We're the 4th in the world, and the French research organization, the CNRS is 7th. We have one asset, a considerable asset in France, particularly certainly in terms of research, and I'm very happy about that personally, perhaps linked to the fact that we were created at the end of the Second World War, and we needed to find ways of achieving success in our goals. The third, just above us, is a German body, So Europe has a considerable asset in terms of innovation and research, and that is something we certainly need to bear in mind. I'm not going to look at all the other rankings, but there's one other ranking which was also important. This was a ranking based on hydrogen and different aspects of the hydrogen sector. And the three number one in the world, same order, CEA, IFPEN, and CNRS. On the issue, there's some difficulties at the moment, but you can find the same, and it's confirmed in a number of areas that France has a lot of talent. But of course, we then need to take that to the market. And again, that's something which we sometimes have difficulty with. For example, with COVID vaccines, we're not always able to convert innovation into the production of industrial solutions. I'll skip over the rest quite quickly, and now zoom on biofuels. We'll be talking a lot about those, so I'm maybe not going to go into detail there, but there are two issues. There are biorefineries, and there are projects in the region. We are supporting one of these projects at least. And there's the question of building these biorefineries, but also converting existing biorefineries to see how we can use the outputs. All of this is beginning to be seen as a question of importance, to have energy hubs with different inputs, with different outputs as well. But how this is organized on the scale of the country, the refineries we have, perhaps the refineries need to be perhaps located where there's the most biomass. So we need to think on a national level at how we organize all of this. And the question of energy hubs is the question of the supply of biomass, the supply of electricity. All of this is work that lies ahead of us. We need to structure the supply of raw materials and biomass. These are some of the issues that we're working on with others so that we can look at our territories region by region and have a vision about what the biomass will be, biomass and wastes from biomass, which will be available in 20 years or 30 years, with, of course, climate change, which also has an impact on water resources. So there's a study that we're carrying out, not alone, because IFPEN is not specialist with agriculture, but with the agricultural organization, research organization, INRAE, and of course, the French Met Office, people who are able to produce forecasts of weather. And these are studies, which may be easy to launch such studies, but they're actually very difficult to carry out. So, but we do need to have a collective response to these questions as soon as possible. We need robust solutions. So we need to be able to tell the politicians what the resources are, what we need to provide biofuels. We know that it's not infinite, so we need to make sure that we get it right. That's perhaps because we haven't collectively addressed that question earlier, but this is perhaps part of our fault, but it's something that's being done now. A panel of solutions for low-carbon fuels, we are considered in the rankings that I mentioned earlier as being number one on biofuels, and also for bioproducts. Same thing, but it's not fuels, but all bioproducts. For example, we worked with Michelin to develop one of the components in tires, which are bio-friendly. So that we are waiting for their decision to invest. We also want to be number one in CCUS. I'm not going to go through all of these elements. The most recent one is e-fuels. and I'm going to be almost concluding on that. There is an issue, the question of prices. Somebody has to pay for all of this at the end. So I've given you a few figures, and I've asked for my department to work on this, looking at cement as it is now and decarbonated cement. It's plus 195%. It's a lot more expensive. With carbon capture and storage, we know it's going to be very expensive. But this is just an order of magnitude. Same thing for steel. If you look at steel and decarbonated steel, it will be 25% more. It's not as bad. If we look at plastics from oil and gas and recycled plastics, something like between 50 and 100% more, and it could continue with fuels. Current fuel like kerosene, 1G, and the specialists can tell me if I'm correct, double biofuel, second generation, it's 3, and e-fuels, it's maybe 5 times. That's again, just an order of magnitude. I'd like to recall that when we had the Gilets jaunes in the street, protesting against the carbon tax, which was 2 or 3 cents a litre. And it shows that there is a political difficulty that we have ahead of us. How can we pay for this? Because we're talking about the state budget. It's a difficult time. How can we pay for this energy transition? And who's going to pay for it? Because people who are protesting against 2 or 3 cents a litre, people who couldn't afford it, these were not people who were driving around in big SUVs. These are people who don't have resources. And what we're talking about is things which are expensive, sometimes very expensive. So how can we organize ourselves collectively to approach that particular situation? And that's a real question which is not always explicitly mentioned, but it's a real question, and I think that collectively we need to think about this and try and see how we can get this across, how we can make this a success, and the money that our generation is going to be able to invest is for the benefit of our grandchildren again. So these are not very easy political questions. So I think I have finished, but I've ended on a positive note.
Merci à l'IFP Énergie Nouvelles. Merci Monsieur Chevet. Nous poursuivons maintenant avec un regard du monde économique. Je vais inviter Audrey Leclerc à rejoindre le pupitre de présentation. Comment démocratiser les mobilités bas carbone? La démarche Leclerc, acteur majeur des mobilités en France, nous partage cette vision au sujet de la décarbonation des transports en France.
Bonjour, merci.
Well,
merci de votre
good morning and thank you very much for this talk. Thank you, Mr. Chauvet. This is something which is really very much in line with what I'm going to present to you. So we're very happy to be here with you in Pau. So we are a small Leclerc delegation in this room. I am here with Thierry Faurien, Quentin Guillard, our legal expert, and I am the manager for sustainable management for our cooperative company called E.Leclerc, which is part of Leclerc. So you may well wonder what Leclerc, a major actor in supermarkets and hypermarkets, has to say here. Well, I can explain some aspects to you to explain the actual crucial role of a company like ours in mobilities and particularly active mobilities. So what is Leclerc? Just as a reminder, Leclerc is an association of 550 members, all independent traders running stores that all share the same values. Leclerc is not a consolidated company, it's not a group, and I'm sure that the guys from Pau know that about us. We are a leading brand in supermarkets, and our model is a model of solidarity, very much committed on the local territories, and this has been so for since 1949. We're committed to the quality of life and, above all, the maintenance of the purchasing power of our consumers. And among our battles, if I may say, we are also very much committed to culture. So we have here several shops, one in Pau, in Mazères, in Tarbes. We have what we call cultural centers. We actually do disseminate culture through our products, and we also have quite a number of very strong local initiatives. We have, therefore, also a national theatre, which is located in Tarbes, called the Parvis. And this is just to show you that we are deeply committed with our territory. So Leclerc sort of built on, I would say, ecology, and this is really part of our history. In fact, Leclerc is, I would say, we have to pay tribute to Leclerc for working for the liberalization of the price of energy, and in particular for fuels for cars. So Siplec is our fuel importing company. And Leclerc indeed is a central actor in mobility. We represent about 1/4 of the sale of fuels for cars. We have a total of 130 filling stations over the territory, so every second 6 cars are being refilled. We also have now electric points of charge, and we are also now having a fleet of car on lease for the day, for example, of rental, actually not lease but rental rather. And this is all part of our history. So our commitment for low carbon mobility or decarbonated mobility is nothing new. We've been a pioneer in France with the inclusion of biofuels starting in the 1990s, first of all with rapeseed oil and then super ethanol. And we are indeed extremely proud because we were the first ones to sell it in the Marne region. That was again in the 1990s. We were also the first ones to remove palm oil and soybean oil in order to avoid deforestation. And we were also extremely proud in the early 2000s to have the first Zoe cars, an electric car, in our Pont-l'Abbé shop in the store in Brittany. And we got the support of the French government indeed to further develop alternative mobilities. Well, that's of course part of the past, but I like to insist on this. This is just to show you that we are indeed keen on working in this area. And for the past 2 years, we have indeed accelerated our restructuring plan concerning decarbonation. So the whole of the company is now highly mobilized at all stages. And this is a way of creating jobs, but it's also a way of structuring an action plan which is probably difficult to lead and to complete, but we believe that our role as a company and with our social responsibility is to help and support consumers. So we believe that the most sustainable type of offer should also also be the one that should be easily accessed by everyone. You know that the government has now recently issued another plan concerning global warming. We're not happy to think that we may be reaching 4 more degrees by the next few years. So this is quite worrisome indeed. So we have a stronger commitment. We had a press conference only recently. We decided that we should reduce our greenhouse gas effects reduction by 30% until by 2035. And you have to know that the carbon footprint is indeed pretty high for companies like ours. So we want to be very proactive and pragmatic, and we want to talk to everyone. And this is indeed our take-home message. I think we really need to have people join us. In other words, we are very locally implemented, and we have to think at the local level and not exclude any solution. So it's our need to help any car driver to move towards a different type of fuel. So for that, we have 3 possible leverages, if I may say. And if you don't mind, I will get back to the points you mentioned in your talk. So first of all, we want to promote electric mobility everywhere in France with more equipment. We also want to accelerate on developing low-carbon fuels. It's our belief that this is really crucial, and we work with a syndicate of bioethanol producers for that. We want also to continue with HVO as a replacement for diesel oil, HVO, and we also have a proactive plan for bioethanol as a replacement for petrol. Of course, our commitment is also in terms of prices. All these solutions will work if they are accepted by the consumer. So for that, they have to be made easy and accessible at a low cost for the customer. We don't want any more of those yellow vests demonstrations about the price of fuels. So we're going pretty fast, actually. We are now the second player in France with the refilling of electric vehicles on our parking places. And by the end of the year, we will have also another offer for electric mobility so that consumers will easily find the most accessible charge station. And we also have, of course, a green offer for that, thanks to local initiatives and thanks to the photovoltaic panels that we are developing over our shops and car parks.
And we also have a mobility
offer that will be part of our fidelity program. So this will really offer the consumers and the clients more initiatives to continue with e-fuels. Of course, now it's mandatory for us to have those charging stations on our car parks. But with the current deregulation, if we have just 10% of charging stations in a car park of 1,000 spots is certainly oversized today. And in other words, our message is to adapt the regulation, taking into account the actual power of all those stations and of the sizes of car parks. But let us not take into account this absolute number, which is totally meaningless. In fact, what counts is to meet the real needs of the consumers over the French territory. So that's it for the e-fuels. Besides, in addition, Leclerc is also a partner to car makers